Hello, readers by eyes and by ears. This is Mari Chan, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today we are continuing with the reading of Stars of Chaos, Volume 2, also known as Chapeau by Priest. We'll be covering chapters 46 through 49 today, and that is also the start of Arc 6. So without further ado, I hope you all enjoy. Wind and rain sweep across a gloomy sky. Arc 6, The Frost Endured. Chapter 46, Drunk. That year, the nation ushered out the old and welcomed the new. The Marquis of Anding handed over his black iron tiger tally, and the implementation of the marching orders decree was a foregone conclusion. The Ministry of War rapidly dispatched specially appointed officers throughout the nation to supervise the troops. With this, the long-gone emperor tightened the reins on the military to an unprecedented extreme that surpassed even Emperor Wu. Perhaps the only thing that didn't cause Li Feng undue frustration as the new year drew to a close was the ease with which Gu Yuan adapted to his present circumstances. And just as Chang'e had predicted, having achieved the results he wanted, the emperor showed ample regard for Gu Yuan's station, promoting Shen Yi 2 ranks and issuing an imperial decree appointing him commander-in-chief of the Southwest Army. At the same time, he conferred the title of Prince Yanbei on the 4th Imperial Prince Li Min. On the 16th day of the month, in the name of celebrating the Marquis of Anding's birthday, old Mr. Shun dragged over 2 giant carts full of gifts and completely blocked the front gate of the Marquis estate. Old Mr. Shun had retired from his post many years ago, and his only child, Shen Yi, was an unambitious idler. Shen Yi had been peculiar since he was a child. He was decent at both the literary and martial arts, yet refused to focus on either. Instead, he preferred to sit in his courtyard and mess around with steam engines. Every single mechanical device in the Shun family home, from great machines like the iron puppet that guarded the property to the gas lamps of all shapes and sizes that hung within the house, had been picked to pieces by Shen Yi. Old Mr. Shun was a devout Taoist and believed in following one's natural inclinations in all things. Yet perhaps the strength of his faith was somewhat lacking, for he still clung to certain hopes and aspirations for his son. Gu Yuan had been called to the palace to discuss business first thing in the morning and had already left the estate. Although he spent most of the year away from the capital, he was nevertheless a powerful individual of high status, so there was no shortage of people who sent gifts. Since the Marquis estate had no mistress to manage the house, the responsibility for sorting out New Year gifts registries fell to the old housekeeper. Hearing that old Mr. Shun had come to add to the pile, Chang'e followed the old housekeeper to the gate to greet him and peered at him in curiosity. Old Mr. Shun was quite the eccentric himself. He had spent his youth indulging in pleasure and carried on in that vein into midlife before eventually tiring of it all in his old age. It was at that point that he began to fixate on Taoist theories of transcendence and immortality. These days, he concerned himself little with the ways of the human world and instead spent his time pursuing his twin passions, alchemy and wine-making. Among his gifts to Gu Yuan, there were no precious metals or gemstones, no bolts of fine silk or satin, and no rare antiques or curious treasures. Instead, he had come bearing 2 cartloads of wine, all of which he had vented himself. Torn between laughter and tears, Chang'e glanced up to see the newly minted Southwest Army commander hurtling over on horseback, looking frazzled beyond belief. The old Mr. Shun had acted completely on his own, and by the time Shen Yi caught on and chased him down, it was too late. As he took in the sight of the wine carts barricading the Marquis estate's front gates, Shen Yi couldn't find the tears to cry. He buried his face in his horse's mane and thought, "This is way too embarrassing." When Gu Yuan returned that evening, it was to the sight of his household unloading the wine carts while Shen Yi stood to the side, whey-faced. Who knew what the emperor had said to him, but Gu Yuan was unusually subdued. He was ordinarily ecstatic to return to the Marquis estate, yet today, when he passed through the gate, he neither smiled nor cracked his usual joke with the guard on duty. It seemed he was well and truly unhappy. What are you doing here? Guyuan asked. Shunyi nodded toward the ridiculous wine cart. A bribe from my old man to thank you for supporting my promotion. Guyuan inhaled deeply through his nose and stepped forward to pick up one of the jars. There, by the front gate, he broke the clay seal and sniffed the contents, then swallowed a mouthful. Excellent timing. Your dad made this himself, didn't he? I can tell just from the smell. Guyuan sighed happily. This works out well. Since you're here already, you might as well stay. We'll go our separate ways before the end of the month. And with the two of us on opposite ends of the country, who knows when we'll meet again. Stay and drink with me tonight. This was precisely Shunyi's intention, so he gladly agreed. Where's Shangung? Guyuan asked. In the kitchen. Guyuan's footsteps paused. What? He insisted on making the noodles himself, Shunyi laughed. Uncle Wong really did try, but he couldn't be stopped. That commandery prince of ours is quite the character. He holds the line when facing enemies on the battlefield and performs acupuncture when offered. He filigrees leather sachets in his spare time and is a deft hand even in the holy ground of the kitchen. If he were a young lady, even the Black Iron Battalion couldn't fight off the suitors swarming your door. Guyuan knitted his brows. A gentleman stays clear of the kitchen. This is absurd. Noticing the odd expression lingering on Guyuan's face, Shunyi asked, What's wrong? Why did His Majesty summon you to the palace? Guyuan paused, then lowered his voice. His Majesty wishes to punish Master Feng Han. What? Shunyi was stunned. Master Feng Han was surnamed Zhang and bore the courtesy name Feng Han. He had been head of the Lingshu Institute for 18 years. During Shunyi's days there, he had worked directly under Master Feng Han's supervision. The man was already over the age of 60 and had spent his entire life at the Lingshu Institute. He never married and had neither wife nor children, nor did he have any fondness for those of his own sex. Rumor had it that even the servants in his residence were made of iron. Aside from himself, the only living creature on the premises was an old dog on death's door. Yet this was only gossip. No one, not even Shunyi, had ever visited Master Feng Han's estate. The old gentleman had a rather odd personality. He was reluctant to entertain guests and had dedicated his life to the world of steam engines and steel armor. He had taken a clear stand when Guyuan had rebuilt the Black Iron Battalion, but aside from that instance, he barely acknowledged other people, much less concerned himself with governance. How could someone so indifferent toward worldly affairs anger the emperor? But why? Asked Shunyi. The old fellow submitted a memorial expressing his opposition to the token of mastery law. His Majesty is furious. Shunyi frowned. But he's always been opposed to it. He hasn't stopped protesting since the token of mastery law was announced. One of my old classmates told me he submits a memorial every 3 days, rain or shine. His Majesty never paid him any attention before. Why would he suddenly... The token of mastery law was the ordinance that restricted the activities of civilian artificers. It had been subject to a period of intense debate when first unveiled, but the discussion had soon been drowned out by the tidal waves of controversy raised by the marching orders decree. Master Feng Han's temper really is... Guyuan sighed. You didn't see what he wrote in his memorial the other day. He said the token of mastery law restrains not just the artificers, but the wisdom and intellect of the people, and that, in the long term, implementing the policy would imperil the nation. While we sit twiddling our thumbs, the far westerners will come flying in on their steam-powered machines like immortals, rising through mist to knock on Great Liang's door. The way I see it, he came just short of pointing a finger at His Majesty and calling him a traitor to the nation. Honestly, His Majesty ordinarily wouldn't have stooped to this level. But ever since the disturbance on the southern border, the Emperor's mind has been in a knot over these matters. Winter is nearly over, but this knot has yet to be untied. The old man ran right into the cannon's muzzle. Guyuan shook his head. His Majesty stopped me today as I was leaving. He said, We have asked ourselves and searched our soul. Ever since we ascended the throne, we have been so diligent in our duties that we frequently lose sleep. Why is it, then, that the nation is not at peace? You tell me what I could possibly say to that. It had only been a few short years since the long-gone emperor's ascension. Yet first his own blood brother had been caught plotting rebellion with the Dongying people, then a regional commander had colluded with mountain bandits in an armed insurrection. To the emperor, each of these incidents was the greatest of mockeries. Meanwhile, the violet gold black market, which continued unabated despite repeated prohibitions, had become a major source of anxiety. Shunyi fell silent as the two walked side by side into the Marquis estate's inner courtyard. Although Master Feng Han was undoubtedly courting trouble by speaking out, they both knew what he said made perfect sense. If the civilian artificers were banned from practicing their trade and everyone had to rely on the Lingshu Institute, how could the Institute's artificers have time to innovate? Furthermore, the priority of the Lingshu Institute had always been military armor. How much room was there for growth and development of technologies used by civilians? Is there anything you can do to save him? Shunyi asked quietly. Guyuan glanced up at the twilight sky stretching over the outermost reaches of the capital and exhaled a white cloud into the cold air. I don't know. I'll do what I can. Shunyi nodded. After a beat he said, Sir, I grew up in the capital, but there are times I can't even breathe when I'm here. Guyuan passed over the jug of wine without a word, and Shunyi took a swig of his family vintage. This wine was so strong he could barely choke it down. He clapped Guyuan on the back. Everyone's waiting to celebrate your birthday. Make sure to do something about that sour face when we head in there. The two of them stood in that sheltered walkway, taking turns sipping from the earthenware jar until they'd polished off the contents. Wine had the power to relieve anxieties and warm the blood. It could add a rosy flush to one's cheeks and allow one to set the concerns of the present and future aside and relax, at least for a while. However, when Guyuan stepped into the inner courtyard, he was nevertheless rather stunned. By the looks of it, Good Chun had dug out a number of the Marquis estate's old iron puppets that had been relegated to scrap. Who knew how much time it had taken him to fix them all? The giant pitch-black machines moved as fluidly as the day they were made as they lined up in a ragged row. Relieved of their armor and weaponry, each puppet had instead been equipped with a pair of silk fans, and the whole troupe was now performing a joyful but disorganized folk dance in the middle of the courtyard. The principal dancer and only flesh-and-blood body in the group was the gaily dressed Cao Nyangzi. Guyuan was at a loss for words. Shaking his head, Shunyi sighed deeply. What a genius! Come again? Shunyi slung an arm over his shoulders. That kid Guchun is a real prodigy. Whenever I remember that the first steam-powdered armor he ever touched came from me, I honestly... I wish I could steal him away to the southern border. Guyuan held his tongue. Something about General Shun's words seemed a bit off. As promised, Changgang had prepared Guyuan a bowl of longevity noodles. Last time, he had cracked in an egg and ended up serving him the shell as well. When he stepped into the estate kitchen today, this young man seemed to be an entirely different person. His present cooking skills could hardly be compared with his past efforts. The noodles were mouth-wateringly good. After finishing the food, Guyuan practically inhaled the bowl with it, and never uttered such discouraging words as, "A gentleman stays clear of the kitchen," ever again. 3 bowls of wine later, everyone in the courtyard was behaving outlandishly. All these years, from the capital to the western regions, from the northern border to Lowland, everywhere I went, you were always by my side. Shunyi sighed. It's going to feel strange now without you. Enough with the chit-chat, Guyuan said. Drink. Guchan scurried over. General Shan, he said earnestly, I have some friends from the Jianghu in the southwest. If you run into any trouble, ask them for help. Shunyi was so moved that tears welled in his eyes. Never mind your Jianghu friends. Will you give me one of your wooden birds? The two beheld each other tearfully, feeling as though they had found a long-lost friend, before running off to engage in a heated discussion on improving the lifespan of steam engines. They were punished by Guyuan with 3 bowls of wine apiece. After downing his penalty, Guchun rolled under the table and disappeared. Exhausted by his stint in the spotlight, Cao Chunhua, too, finally collapsed in a tangled heap among the iron puppets in the courtyard. Chang'ung was stretched in 4 directions at once, taking care of one person after another. In the end, everyone was plastered. Yanking on Guyuan, Shenyi rambled through the thick slur, mangling his words. Zishi, oh Zishi, the Gu family stands where the winds and waves are the fiercest. It's always stood where the winds and waves are the fiercest. You must be careful. Guyuan lay collapsed against a jug of wine. He had no desire to move, nor did he wish to speak, so he only laughed. Once he started, it was difficult to stop, and he laughed until tears streamed down his face. He thought, I'm the only member of the Gu family left. Shen Yi staggered to his feet, swayed 2 steps to the side, and fell over with a loud thud, mumbling all the while, His Majesty is scared of you. It was hard to say who His Majesty was or wasn't scared of, but Chang'ung was certainly a bit scared of both of them right now. He hastily beckoned the estate's guards over and directed them to help Shunyi up. Hurry and carry General Shun to one of the spare rooms. Guyuan leaned against the table with his head propped in one hand, an inscrutable smile on his face. If not for the slackness of his gaze, one might think he was cold sober. Through the efforts of the diligent, if somewhat clumsy, estate guards, Shenyi was pulled upright, but still refused to behave. Struggling against the guard's supporting hands, he slurred, You, good Zishi, you might have gotten over it, but His Majesty hasn't. He's scared of you, just like the late Emperor. How can he not be scared? They wounded you so grievously back then. They tried to destroy you, but you survived. And the Black Iron Battalion is still so powerful. These people think to themselves, if the situation were reversed, how would they retaliate? They judge others by their own measures, Zishi. Everyone in this world judges others by their own measure. Chang'ung's ability to hold his liquor was no better than average. At Guyuan's insistence, he had already drunk plenty and was barely holding on to a sliver of clarity. Yet, at Shunyi's words, a chill slid down his spine, sobering him instantly. What did "they tried to destroy you" mean? Were Shunyi's words merely the ramblings of a drunk man? Chang'ung couldn't help but step forward in an attempt to hear more clearly. Yet, after howling a little longer, Shunyi turned to clutch the pillar behind him and hurled. Once he was done making a mess, he collapsed weakly, like a pile of wet mud, and passed out drunk. Chang'ung was at his wit's end. He had no choice but to ask the still sober members of the household to carry away the sloppy drunks slumped around the courtyard one by one. Finally, all that remained were a handful of iron puppets still dutifully swinging their limbs as tendrils of white steam emanated from their heads. The sounds of laughter and cheer in the capital slowly faded away. Guyuan was half lying on the table. He seemed disoriented and mumbled in a voice that was barely discernible. Not so tough after all, huh? These losers can't even walk on their own 2 legs. They had to be carried out. The nerve of this man! Sighing, Chang'ung played along, coaxing him in a low voice. That's right. You're the toughest of them all. Since you're so tough, let's walk back to your room. I'll help you, okay? Guyuan looked at him, his eyes so deep and dark that the reeling sensation of drunkenness Chang'ung had just suppressed reared its head once again. Ah, Yan, Guyuan called out quietly. Chang'ung frowned. Ah, Yan. Guyuan giggled. He said with a mix of helpless exasperation and his usual acerbic irreverence, I'll tell you a secret, but you mustn't tell anyone else. Your dad is a real bastard. Chang'ung stared. What kind of nonsense was this? Guyuan chuckled softly under his breath and whispered incoherently, Who knows what frost endures this heart of mine? Who'll share with me this cup of bitter wine? Chang'ung had no intention of having a staring contest with the drunkard. He helped Guyuan up and dragged him to his bedroom. He groped at Chang'ung like an incorrigible old lecher. With Guyuan's hands all over him, Chang'ung was so agitated he had a mind to fling him directly onto the bed. Yet, when he looked down at Marshal Gu's hard wooden bed with its thin, cotton-padded mattress, he didn't have the heart to drop him. And who could have known that Guyuan would abruptly twist around and grasp at the sensitive nerve at Chang'ung's elbow? Chang'eng was caught by surprise. He felt his arm go weak and nearly dropped Gu Yun. In his haste to catch him, Chang'eng lost his balance as well and found himself dragged over the top of him. The sudden weight of Chang'eng crashing into his chest knocked the air from Gu Yuan's lungs. After panting a while, Gu Yuan patted Chang'eng on the back and said nonsensically, "Ayo, darling, you're crushing me to death." As Chang'eng lay against Gu Yuan's body, a quiet shoot unfurled from the seed he had struggled to bury deep in the darkness of his heart. Staring closely at the pale lips of Gu Yuan's jaw, he suddenly asked in a low voice, "Who are you calling out to?" Gu Yuan made no sound. Chang'eng was drunk. How else would he act so fearlessly? He pressed closer, taking hold of Gu Yuan's chin. "Yifu, who are you calling?" The word Yifu seemed to jog Gu Yuan's memory. "Chang'eng," he mumbled. Those two syllables were like a blunt piece of iron brushing past Chang'eng's ears. A rumbling explosion went off in his head, and the words, "Let nature take its course," propelled him forward as he leaned down and kissed Gu Yuan as though possessed. Gu Yuan started in surprise. After several long moments, he slowly reacted. He clung clumsily to Chang'eng's collar, then abruptly shoved him away. Chang'eng's back slammed against Gu Yuan's rock-hard bed. His mind cleared. The color drained from his face. "What am I doing?" he thought in a panic. Gu Yuan gazed down at him from above. Chang'eng opened his mouth to call out, "Yifu," and found himself unable to speak. Suddenly, Gu Yuan smiled. The drunkard no longer seemed to recognize him and reached out to stroke his cheek. He slurred in a nasal voice, "Now, behave." He took Chang'eng, who was stiff as a board from head to toe, into his arms and earnestly pressed a line of kisses from his brow to his lips. He licked open the seam of Chang'eng's mouth with utmost tenderness, treating him to a lingering yet fervent bout of sweet torture. His hands weren't idle either, as they fumbled with Chang'eng's lapels. Chang'eng felt like he was about to explode. His hand shook as he held Gu Yuan's waist, yet he resisted tightening his grip. Gu Yuan seemed to sense the trembling of his body. He was surprisingly poised in bed, as one would expect from an elegant young master of an aristocratic family. As he groped at Chang'eng's belt, he flashed him a smile overflowing with intoxication. "Don't be scared," he coaxed gently. "Stay with me and I'll treat you well." Chang'eng lowered his voice to the barest whisper and asked hoarsely, "Who am I?" Gu Yuan stared blankly, then paused to ponder his question. Alas, his sodden brain was incapable of such mental exercise. Not only did he fail to reach a definitive conclusion, he also managed to tangle himself in Chang'eng's belt. He fussed with it for half an age, but the more he tried to loosen it, the tighter the knot became. In the end, exhausted from trying to unfasten Chang'eng's robes, Gu Yuan flopped to the side and fell asleep. In the depth of the stillness that followed, Chang'eng gritted his teeth and painstakingly counted his long, shuddering breaths. By the time he got to 60, he had scraped together his strength to push Gu Yuan aside and climb to his feet. He yanked his belt from Gu Yuan's grip, laid him flat on the bed, and pulled a blanket haphazardly over his body. Unable to stay for a second more, he turned around and fled. Chapter 47. Muddy Waters. When Gu Yuan awoke, the sun was high in the sky. He had been upset the night before, so he had drunk to drown his sorrows and gotten successfully sloshed. When he managed to drag himself out of bed, his body was so stiff he felt more exhausted than if he'd gone the entire night without sleep. Someone had set out a bowl of hangover remedy on the little table in his room. Gu Yuan carried it over and, pinching his nose, drained it in a single gulp. Only then did he crack open his crusty eyes. He sat on his bed in a daze and conducted an impromptu round of self-reflection. In his half-awake state, he found that he had been unreasonably anxious lately. "Are things really as bad as that?" Gu Yuan asked himself honestly with a yawn. Upon careful consideration, of course they weren't. The national treasury was more strapped for cash in recent years, so it was natural that military funding had tightened up. Even so, things hadn't gotten to the point where people were going hungry. The heavens had also been relatively kind. There had been a handful of floods and earthquakes, as well as the droughts a couple years back, but nothing severe. The Central Plains were so vast that the imperial court had to fret over disaster relief when any random cloud presided over by an errant dragon god was so much as convulsed. Yet, since the first year of the long-gone emperor's reign, the nation had been remarkably peaceful. There were the two incidents in Jiangnan and the southwest, but although they had raised quite the furor and been a source of great alarm for the emperor to Guyuan, these were minor scuffles. Regarding the East Sea, Prince Wei had clearly been still in the midst of preparations when his tracks were revealed thanks to leaks from his violet gold smuggling operation. Meanwhile, the situation on the southern border had been an inopportune collision of multiple forces. Fu Cheng had likely never intended to rebel in the first place. In short, these incidents were hardly as dangerous as hunting down raiders in the desert. What were today's troubles compared to when he had led the military campaign against the six nations of the western regions? Back then, the country had lacked strong soldiers, and the responsibility for holding up the vast nation of Great Liang had fallen on his own shoulders. In those days, he had spent each day wondering whether he would see the sun the next morning, but his mind had been free from distractions. Yet now, despite wielding great power and having the leisure to watch iron puppets perform a folk dance in his courtyard, he felt the need to drown his sorrows. Some hero he was. And then, after soaking himself in wine, he'd gone and done something. What was it again? That's right, Guyuan thought, rubbing his temples in bewilderment. I harassed a servant girl and scared her half to death. How disgraceful, Guyuan muttered as he washed up and began to change his clothes. Halfway through changing, he froze. That's not right. This estate doesn't have a female horse in the stables. Where did a servant girl come from? Guyuan finally woke up completely. He mulled things over, his face ashen, then turned back to uplift the blanket, only to see something roll out from the corner of the bed. It was Changgung's filigree sachet. Guyuan stared at it in silence. Shunyi couldn't hold his liquor, so he had been even drunker than Guyuan. He hadn't even opened his eyes yet that morning when Guyuan burst into the guest room and dragged him out of bed. I need to talk to you. Guyuan looked like he had seen a ghost. Shunyi didn't dare ignore him. A jumble of wild guesses ran through his mind. Fujicheng broke out of prison? The emperor convicted Master Feng Han of a crime? The northern barbarians invaded? Or could it be that the backbone of the Great Liang's military, the Central Plains garrison, launched an armed rebellion? Indisposed as he was, Shunyi did his best to compose himself and waited for Guyuan to speak. However, after he'd hemmed and hawed for several minutes, his gaze flitting up to the roof beams and down to his shoes, that goo bastard didn't issue so much as a fart. What's wrong? Shunyi asked cautiously, heart in his mouth. A pause. Forget it. I don't feel like talking anymore. Shunyi lost it, so angry he nearly blew a fuse. With the way this man spoke in halves, it was a wonder no one had stabbed him to death. Wait. Shunyi lurched forward and grabbed Guyuan. What exactly is going on? He demanded furiously. After his discovery of the evidence left on his bed, Guyuan had slowly unearthed the memories from the night before. The things he said, the things he did, everything flashed before his eyes in lurid color. He had been so embarrassing, so sleazy, so despicable. Guyuan covered his face with his hands. What have I done? He could feel acid lapping up from his stomach. Do I go crazy when I get drunk? He asked Shunyi miserably. You've never really gotten that drunk before, have you? Shunyi hugged his blankets to himself and curled up by the head of the bed. These two soldiers lived on the frontiers year-round. Even when they drank, they never risked getting drunk, lest some emergency arise and they botch a military operation. What? Shunyi examined Guyuan's complexion, then asked with great interest, Did you do something embarrassing yesterday? Guyuan reached over and shoved his face, so eager to feast on his misfortunes, back into the blankets. He drifted out of the room in a daze, thinking perhaps he ought to find a belt with which to hang himself. At first, Guyuan thought optimistically, Little Chang'eng wouldn't hold a grudge against a drunk, right? I certainly wouldn't take it seriously if I were him. At most, he'd use it to tease the boy for about a year. Wait, what? But soon, that small spot of optimism faded away. Last night, when he had pressed Chang'eng down on the bed, Chang'eng had been shaking the entire time. Not only had Chang'eng taken it seriously, he'd also been mad as hell. Guyuan's expression was woeful as he held Chang'eng's sachet. He felt as though he were carrying a bomb that might explode in his face at any time. The faint, refreshing scent of pacifying fragrance saturated the air, filling Guyuan's nose as he schemed in silence. Do I feign confusion? Ignorance? Should I act like nothing happened? Before he could decide, he ran into the old housekeeper. Guyuan promptly assumed the honorable mien of an upright gentleman and asked, Uncle Wang, where is His Highness? I was about to come tell you, my lord, said the old housekeeper. His Highness left for the National Temple first thing this morning. Guyun was stunned. Chang'eng was so angry he ran away from home? The Marquis looked like he had swallowed a mouthful of bitter medicine, but the old housekeeper didn't notice. One more thing, he continued. Justice Jiang of the Imperial Court of Judicial Review sent over a painting in celebration of my lord's birthday. There was a letter enclosed for the gift. Would you like to read it now? Guyuan blinked in surprise. Yes, give it here. Shen Yi had somehow managed to become a general by following Guyuan, but, in truth, he had a scholarly background. Back in the day, he had risen through the imperial examination system. Chief Justice Jiang Chong of the Imperial Court of Judicial Review was his shishong, and it was through this connection that the justice had become acquainted with Guyuan. The two discovered that they got along very well and had gradually struck up a friendship. However, to avoid arousing any suspicion, they rarely sought out each other's company. After unfolding the letter and skimming its contents, Guyuan found he had more pressing matters to attend to than Chang'eng's tantrum. After observing the usual niceties, Jiang Chong's letter succinctly divulged a piece of news to Guyuan. The emperor intended to take decisive action to dismantle the violet gold black market once and for all. Such a simple sentence, yet its implications were enormous. That evening, Kite's flight pavilion was as noisy and bustling as ever. Within the Empyrean room, the newly appointed Southwest Army Commander Shen Yi was hosting a banquet. He had invited his old classmates from the capital as well as his former peers from the Lingshu Institute. Shen Yi would soon travel to the southwest to take up a new post. Although this post was far from the capital, it was nevertheless a grand promotion, and all his old friends had clamored for him to treat them to dinner. Toward the end of the feast, after 3 rounds of toast had come and gone, the Marquis of Anding made an appearance. He stayed for a brief time, then excused himself once again to attend to matters at home. Shortly after he left, Jiang Chong, the sitting Chief Justice of the Imperial Court of Judicial Review, also said his goodbyes and took his leave. Jiang Chong exited Kite's flight pavilion, but did not climb into his carriage. Instead, he dismissed his attendants so he might take a stroll to sober up, leaving only a young servant boy to follow in his wake. He walked along the icy river, down a small side road lined with frosted willows, and turned a corner. There, he saw an inconspicuous old carriage waiting for him. The carriage's hanging screen lifted, revealing Gu Yuan's shadowed profile. It's bitterly cold tonight. Please allow me to give you a lift home, Han Shishong. Then I'll thank you for your trouble, Jiang Chong responded. A silent understanding flowed between them, and he climbed into Gu Yuan's carriage. Justice Jiang was already 40, but his age didn't show on his face. If not for his staid bearing, one might mistake him for a young master from a noble family. After settling himself in the carriage, Jiang Chong accepted Gu Yuan's hand warmer to allay the chill. He got straight to the point. After the Marquis left the palace the other day, His Majesty summoned the heads of the 3 judicial offices for a secret meeting. He intends to employ a 2-pronged approach. Not only will he bring back the gold consolidation decree, he also plans to use the insurrection on the southern border as an excuse to make some bold moves. He wants a thorough investigation of the domestic violet gold black market, and he's starting with the Southwest. The gold consolidation decree was a relic from the reign of Gu Yuan's maternal grandfather, Emperor Wu of Liang. In those days, Maritime trade was still in its infancy, and civilian use of violet gold was difficult to control. To strengthen regulations, Emperor Wu issued 4 harsh decrees, which became known collectively as the Gold Consolidation Decree. As civilian use of steam engines and steel armor became increasingly widespread, the Gold Consolidation Decree eventually became obsolete. All 4 decrees were ultimately repealed during the Yuanhe Emperor's reign. The Marquis will be returning to the northwest shortly after the new year. Even if the imperial court sees a great upheaval, it's unlikely to affect you. But the Marquis has been stationed on the border for so long. Should His Majesty follow through with this strict investigation of the black market, I fear that your position will inevitably invite suspicion. Please be careful. Jiang Chong couldn't point directly at Gu Yuan and say, I know your hands are dirty too. The crackdowns have been very strict recently, so you better clean up your black market connections and put things on hold for a few days. Nevertheless, his meaning was quite plain. Many thanks for your advice, Han Shishong, said Gu Yuan gratefully. Seeing that Gu Yuan had received the message, Jiang Chong didn't belabor the point. He smiled stiffly and said, Whenever violet gold is involved, we're forced to deal with diabolical individuals. It's one thing for these nefarious criminals to do as they please in the Jianghu, but I'm afraid there are plenty of court officials secretly involved as well. Who should be investigated, and how should the investigation proceed? To be honest, I have no idea either. Just as water that is too clear has no fish, one who is too self-righteous will have no friends. It was difficult to say whether the long-gone emperor's goal was to bring peace to the land or incite pandemonium. Guyuan recognized the difficulty of his position. Don't worry, Han Shishong. Once this news gets out, anyone with eyes and ears won't need to be told twice to keep a low profile. After all, we'll all be much more anxious than you are. When the time comes, if you encounter any trouble, send me a letter. I no longer hold the Black Iron Tiger Tally, so I haven't the authorization to deploy the country's armed forces, but His Majesty is still willing to give me some face. Jiang Chong's smile was strained. In that case, you have my thanks. First, there was the Token of Mastery Law, and now there's the Gold Consolidation Decree. I rarely leave the capital, so I'm often ignorant of these things, but I have heard that, in the past, white steam filled the streets and the night watch sounded without the aid of a human hand. People used to speak of a magnificent future in which everyone rode flying horses. Yet these days, such dreams have long since faded. Guyuan fiddled idly with the worn wooden beads around his wrist and changed the subject. How is Master Feng Han doing? Still locked up, Jiang Chong answered, but don't worry. I've made sure he'll be looked after. Do you intend to submit a memorial to clarify the situation on his behalf? Guyuan smiled bitterly. Me? Any memorial I submit would only hasten his death. Actually, there's no need to clarify anything. Many of the devices in the Imperial Palace are products of the Lingshu Institute. When His Majesty sees them, he'll naturally recall Master Feng Han's virtues. The Master has always been enthralled with steam-powered devices and inept at navigating human relationships. His Majesty also knows the old fellow has a terrible temper. In a few days, His Majesty's anger will wane, and everything will work out. These words were easily said, but once the imperial temper cooled, the question of how to deftly remind the emperor of Master Feng Han would require careful consideration. How to bring up the master artificer who treated his dog like his son in such a way that His Majesty would find the old man fondly exasperating and thus be incapable of flying into a fury once again. Jiang Chong glanced at Gu Yuan. This man had likely already made the necessary arrangements without anyone the wiser. The Marquis of Anding had grown up in the imperial palace, so it wasn't unusual for him to have some connections there. However, the Marquis seems to have grown much more diplomatic since your return from the northwest this time, Jiang Chong observed quietly. With tigers and wolves prowling at our borders, I must exhaust all my ingenuity and dare not leave a stone unturned, Gu Yuan said sagely. Likewise, with the world in turmoil, I dare not lower myself to engage in petty quarrels for petty reasons. What point is there in throwing tantrums or arguing over such useless things as codes of loyalty? The two of them exchanged a few more words of news, and Jiang Chong bid Gu Yuan farewell. As he slipped out of the carriage, he stopped and turned back to Guyun. Perhaps this is rather insolent of me to say. In recent years, there have been repeat bumper harvests in the regions that have implemented farming puppets, and now there are even new steam-powered machines capable of weaving cloth and sewing garments. Yet, still, the nation treasury remains empty, as if shackled by the various ordinances that have been passed. Despite the passage of so many years, this humble official cannot help but feel as though Great Liang has reverted to the days of Emperor Wu. To be honest, Han Shushong, Gu Yuan said, smiling, I felt inexplicably anxious these past few years as well. But when I think it through carefully, logic tells me my anxieties are baseless. Perhaps all people are like this. We want our lives to improve day by day, so when we reach a plateau, even if we are already well off, we feel a sense of restless frustration. Jiang Chong's expression shifted. He seemed to want to say something, but hesitated. What is it? Asked Gu Yuan. Sometimes, when we investigators are on a case, we're guided by pure intuition, Justice Jiang said in a low voice. The feeling is baseless, but oftentimes it turns out to be correct. The more storied the veteran, the sharper their intuition. The Marquis is someone who has braved untold dangers on the battlefield. Perhaps your intuition is likewise a premonition of things to come. Please take care of yourself. Guyuan flinched in surprise, but held his tongue. The two bid each other farewell and parted ways, each with a heart laden with anxiety. By the time Guyun returned to the Marquis estate, the sky had gone dark. When he asked the estate's guards, they informed him that Chang'e was still out and had only sent a message home saying that since Great Master Liao Zhen had returned to the National Temple, Chang'e planned on staying a few days. He may as well stay for a while, Guyuan thought helplessly, and if his temper cools before he comes back, all the better. Perhaps Chang'e's temper was particularly volatile, for it seemed he fully intended to settle down at the National Temple. 4 or 5 days passed in the blink of an eye. Guyuan wasn't staying long in the capital to begin with. When he left this time, who knew how many years it would be before they saw each other again? Unable to stand it any longer, Guyuan finally held his nose and paid a visit to the National Temple. Liao Zhen was the same as ever. These days around the New Year were the only handful in the entire calendar year in which, in order to meet with honored guests, he bathed properly. He scrubbed himself as clean as a freshwater lotus and spent every waking moment peddling mystifying hokum wherever he went. That afternoon, the monk had finally managed to carve out some time to sit with Chang'e in his room and play Weiqi. They communicated completely in sign language, so though they seemed to sit in tranquil silence, the topics of which they spoke were diverse and plentiful. There is something I want to ask the great master. Chang'e signed. What exactly happened to my Yifu's eyes and ears? Those who speak of others behind their backs come to no good end, Liao Zhen signed rapidly. I need to know, Chang'e signed, his expression resolute, and I will track down everything there is to know about this matter until I get to the bottom of it. If you won't tell me, I'll find someone who will. Liao Zhen looked at him for a long while, his gaze unwavering. With careful deliberation, he signed. This monk has only heard some baseless gossip. When the Marquis was a child, his parents, the former Marquis and the princess, took him to the northern border. At the time, the fighting between Great Liang and the northern barbarians had died down, so it should have been reasonably safe. No one expected that, in a desperate attempt to bring their enemy down with them, the northern barbarian suicide squad would storm the encampment. In the ensuing chaos, the young Marquis was wounded by a stray arrow, and most unfortunately, this arrow was poisoned. Surprisingly, this account matched Gu Yuan's perfunctory explanation. What kind of poison? Chang'e pressed. Liao Zhen shook his head. Your Highness has studied under the tutelage of Miss Chun, so you ought to know. Even the Chun family is helpless in the face of the barbarian's poison. This variety is extremely lethal. Those struck with such a poison arrow soon become paralyzed and die within days. Luckily, this poison happens to act more slowly in children. Old Dr. Chun rushed overnight from Shanxi to the encampment on the northern border and spent 2 sleepless days and nights treating the young Marquis with the Chun family's most advanced acupuncture techniques. He saved his life, but the young Marquis's sight and hearing were severely damaged. Chang Gung's brow creased slightly. The northern border. If the Northern Barbarian Suicide Squad had been the perpetrators, then what did Shen Yi mean when he said they tried to destroy you? Was it really just the ramblings of a drunk? Just then, a young novice monk entered. Your Highness, Liao Zhan Shushu, the Marquis of Anding has come. Chapter 48. A Startling Realization. Liao Zhan stared in surprise. He never thought he would see the day when the Marquis of Anding would honor the national temple with his presence. He hastily signed to Chang Gung. Doesn't the Marquis of Anding find it inauspicious to touch the barest dab of incense ash? Now he's ventured deep into the tiger's lair. Is he going to scrub off a layer of skin with evil-dispelling herbs when he returns home? Chang Gung had no attention for his questions. A disconcerted expression flickered over his features. He wasn't ready to face Gu Yuan's anger and condemnation. In an unexpected turn of events, Chang Gung and Gu Yuan both thought they had transgressed and molested the other while drunk, and now both were suffering from a guilty conscience. Liao Zhan looked at Chang Gung, baffled. In recent years, in order to suppress the wu ge, Chang Gung had cultivated his meditative breathing technique to the pinnacle of perfection. He could sit facing a wall and meditate, unmoving, for days at a time. Even an eminent monk like Liao Zhan gracefully conceded to him in this regard. It wasn't unheard of for agitated people to look into Chang Gung's eyes and find themselves soothed. This incomparably handsome young master sat on the penniless monk's old prayer mat, dressed in white, with a weiqi stone in hand. He seemed to have reached a peaceful and profound state of sublimity, only for the words Marquis of Anding to shatter his serenity like ripples breaking across a pond's still surface. Chang Gung shifted restlessly and lifted his hand without purpose, reaching for heaven's knew what. Halfway through the motion, he noticed Liao Zhan staring steadily. He tamped down his emotions and impassively set his hand on his teacup, then lowered his head and disguised his momentary lapse with a sip of water. Even Great Master Liao Zhan, who was quite practiced at acting mysterious, felt slightly bewildered. What's this? Is the Marquis coming to collect on a debt? A few moments later, Gu Yuan stepped into the room. A barely contained distaste hovered in the arch of his brows and the corner of his eyes, as if he were sorely tempted to walk in on tiptoe. He glanced at Liao Zhan with a sour expression and smiled insincerely. It's been some years since we last met, Great Master. I see you are more pristine than ever. Liao Zhan assumed the demeanor of the Great Master and refrained from stooping to Gu Yuan's level. He pressed his palms together and rose in greeting, signing, Amitabha Buddha, this monk's heart is like a mirror, clear and bright. There is no place for dust to alight. Apparently, it was possible to quote the classics to justify refusing to bathe. Gu Yuan looked as if he had smelled something rancid. Unable to stomach another minute in this dodgy establishment, he turned to Chang Gung. You've disturbed the Great Master's spiritual practice for several days already. It's high time you came home. Chang Gung had spent all these days and much difficulty calming his mind to stillness, only for it to be stirred up once again by the words, came home. He knew that even if he were to sit under a bodhi tree, he still wouldn't be able to recite the words, lust is an unworthy pursuit. Thus, he could only gather up his great mess of feelings and rise obediently to his feet. The stifling scent of the sandalwood incense burning inside the national temple made Gu Yuan cough. He quickly withdrew to wait outside the cell and looked on with intense boredom as Chang Gung said farewell to Liao Zhan. When it came to friends and family, once Gu Yuan had become accustomed to their face, he didn't much notice whether they were attractive or not. Gu Yuan had always thought Chang Gung resembled his northern barbarian mother. It was only now, as he examined him from the doorway, that he realized this wasn't completely true. The young man had grown into his features and was favored with an elegant and handsome face. It was difficult to say at a glance whom he resembled, but like a piece of black jade, there was something about him that was uniquely pleasing to the eye. Guyuan started. He suddenly remembered that there were people from all walks of life in the Jianghu. Since the establishment of maritime trade, the popular customs in Great Liang had become increasingly liberal. In particular, rumor had it that male homosexuality was prevalent in the coastal areas along the East Sea. As a white dragon who had transformed into a fish to swim amongst commoners in the deep pool, could it be that Chang'e had been harassed by someone who didn't know their place? Was that why he was so angry the other day? That's right, Guyun mused, his mind following the thoughts to its logical end as his imagination took off on a wild flight of fancy. If I laid one on Shen Jiping, there's no way he would take it seriously. With that poverty-stricken face of his, he wouldn't think I meant anything by it at all. Honestly, if I kissed him, the one drawing the short straw would be me. The more he thought about it, the more sense it made and the more awkward he felt. After a bit of deliberation, he decided he might as well play dumb. As Zhang strolled over, he said nonchalantly, "Why did you stay for so long? Are the cabbage and tofu at the National Temple that good?" Seeing Guyuan's easy manner, Chang'e relaxed as well. The voice of the Buddha in vegetarian meals help with meditation. Young folks like you ought to wear bright colors and live extravagantly. It's not like you're going to become a monk. What are you meditating for? Walking beside Chang'e, Guyuan was about to sling an arm over his shoulder as usual. But just as he lifted his hand, he was struck by the sudden fear that Chang'e would misconstrue it. He silently withdrew, tucking his hand behind his back instead. "I have considered it," Chang'e said evenly. He'd thought about it more, breaking his worldly ties and taking refuge in a religious life. Maybe that way, all the untamed fantasies in his heart would be transformed by the boundless teachings of Buddha. "What?" Guyuan froze mid-stride. It took several long seconds for him to react as he stared at Chang'e, stupefied. "You mean become a monk?" he asked in disbelief. Chang'e rarely saw such astonishment on his godfather's face. "I only said I thought about it. I didn't have the guts to actually do it," he said with a smile. "Nonsense," Guyuan thought. "If you did, I'd break your legs." But in the end, Guyuan held his tongue. Chang'e was no longer the helpless little godson he could shelter beneath the eaves of the Marquis estate. He had undergone his coming-of-age ceremony and been bestowed the title of Commandery Prince. He still called Guyuan Yifu, but that was purely out of a sense of affection rather than an official status. It was no longer appropriate for Guyuan to lecture this young man as if he were his real son. Thus, he only asked with the slightly downcast expression, "Why?" Chang'e exchanged a polite greeting with a young novice monk who walked past them, then responded, "As a child, I grew up looking at 'The World is Inescapable' calligraphy hanging in Yifu's room. Later, I followed my shifu and traveled the land. I have barely tasted the hardships and perils of the world. How can I withdraw from it? I was born to this world. Although my natural ability is limited and I may not accomplish great feats that stand the test of time like the distinguished sages of the past, the least I can do is be unashamed to face the heavens, the earth, and myself. And you." Chang'e did not speak those last words aloud, hiding them away in his heart. Xiuniang had once dragged Chang'e behind her horse, but in the end she had failed to drag him to death. The Wu-Erge tormented him, but so far it had failed to torment him to madness. At times, Chang'e thought that only by pushing through the stormiest waves, constantly swimming against the current, would he reach a place where he could finally respect himself. And only then would he deserve to dream, however briefly, about his little Yifu in the dead of night. Guyuan's expression cleared, but he still asked unhappily, "Then why do you keep running off to surround yourself with a bunch of monks?" "I come to have tea with Great Master Liao Zhen." Chang'e dodged the question neatly. "Sometimes I suffer from excess internal heat and have trouble sleeping. Miss Chun gave me a prescription for pacifying fragrance, didn't she? It's in my sachet, but I haven't been able to find it these past few days." Guyuan abruptly became mute. "I don't know where I managed to lose it." Chang'e continued, perplexed. At this, Guyuan's complexion turned pale. Some people really were remarkably proficient at hitting right where it hurt. Marshal Gu wrestled with his conscience in silence for a while, but in the end, he reached into his lapels and pulled out that little leather perfume sachet. He handed it to Chang'e. Here. Now it was Chang'e's turn to fall silent. The shocking revelation caught Chang'e, who had inadvertently been snared in a trap by his own making, so off guard that he almost bit through his tongue. Prince Yanbei, who only moments ago had been the paragon of a worldly and capable savant, felt his palms immediately dampen with cold sweat. Why does Yifu have this? He stuttered. With his face thick, which had been thoroughly tempered by all sorts of awkward predicaments, firmly in place, Guyuan said without batting an eye. It fell into my bed somehow. Perhaps I accidentally yanked it off you that day I got roaring drunk. Chang'e examined his expression, petrified. Guyuan shamelessly feigned innocence. What's the matter? Chang'e hurried to shake his head and breathed a sigh of relief. Somehow, he had managed to muddle his way through this disaster and could once again interact with Guyuan calmly and intimately as before. At the same time, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of disappointment. Noticing his change in expression, Guyuan thought Chang'e was still offended, so he offered an olive branch. I forgot to mention this the other day, but His Majesty wants you to start listening in on court assemblies, he said. What kind of position do you want? I'll see if I can put in a word. Chang'e's relaxed expression became serious. Each of the 6 ministries has their own spheres of influence, he said. It wouldn't do for me to disrupt their work. In all these years, I've accrued no civil or military accomplishments and am accustomed to idleness. If His Majesty insists I listen in on court assemblies, then it's enough for me to listen. I wouldn't mind helping Justice Jiang of the Imperial Court of Judicial Review with his investigations either. Guyuan wasn't sure if Chang'e's answer was reflective of his true feelings, but he was certain the Emperor would be happy to hear it. He felt a slight ache in his heart. He didn't want to send Chang'e to the long-gone Emperor only for him to be mistreated, his talents to be wasted. But the alternative was an impossibility. Chang'e's surname was Li. Even if he became an idle prince and succumbed to decadence, there was no way he would spend his whole life hiding away in the Marquis of Anding's estate. You can work in the Imperial Court of Judicial Review if you want, but wait a while. Don't go just yet, Guyuan said. His Majesty intends to investigate the violet gold black market, so Justice Jiang is under a lot of pressure right now. The situation's already messy enough, so stay out of it. Don't get the Lingyuan Pavilion involved. Chang'e hummed in assent. He didn't seem surprised by this news in the least. So soon? I see His Majesty really can't wait. Just the other day, I was wondering when he would reinstate the gold consolidation decree. How do you know about it? Guyuan asked, surprised. Just a guess. A light snow had begun to drift through the air. Chang'e borrowed an oil paper umbrella from the doorway of the monk's cell. The umbrella was small, and Chang'e kept tilting it in Guyuan's direction. In no time at all, his exposed shoulder was covered in a thick layer of snow. He didn't bother to brush it off, but continued to walk at a steady pace, as if relishing the experience. Actually, it's not really a guess. Think about it, Yifu. His Majesty, the long-gone Emperor, the Yuanhe Emperor before him, even Emperor Wu. Although all extraordinarily wise in different ways, when it comes to violet gold, they've all been exactly the same. They all see it as a source of danger and concern. Guyuan had always viewed Chang'e as a child of the younger generation. This was the first time he had walked with him shoulder to shoulder and listened to his thoughts. He found the experience awfully novel, so he didn't interrupt and only listened to him speak. Back when I was young and lived in Yanhui town, I saw with my own eyes the way the Imperial Court squandered manpower and resources for the sake of violet gold. These last few years, I've also had the thought, why control its use so strictly? If violet gold were treated like food or textiles, and everyone could buy however much they wanted, wouldn't the black market cease to exist? Chang'e shook his head, then continued. Later on, I realized that such a thing was impossible. Perhaps it is treasonous to say so, but it doesn't matter who the emperor is, whether they're impotent or enlightened. a frail scholar, or a hale practitioner of martial arts. No one can allow commoners to trade in violet gold. Otherwise, in the future, powerful merchants, Western foreigners, Eastern barbarians, nefarious criminals, and even officials with a few resources, any one of them could hold a blade to the nation's throat. Like those bandits on the southern border, Guyuan said. Exactly. That was only the black market, some bandits, and a handful of mountain peaks near the southern border. But what if we broadened the scope to the entire nation of Great Liang? What if everyone held such a blade? It's impossible for the imperial court to please everyone. If such a time were to come, similar cases would spring up like weeds, and there's no way the government could attend to them all. The nation would be controlled by he who wields the largest weapon. Those who wish to vie for power will stop at nothing to obtain that invaluable dragon-slaying blade and fight to conquer each other. Allowing violet gold to be traded freely would be like raising the legendary goo insect. By the time all the other creatures had been devoured and the goo king rears its venomous head, who will reign supreme over the land? Guyuan frowned. Chang'e, there's no harm in saying this to me, but don't mention this to anyone else. So then, do you mean that the emperor is right to reinstate the gold consolidation decree? No, that's not it. Actually, the best solution would be to keep the late emperor's moderate restrictions on violet gold in place until the situation is stable and focus on resolving the most vital issue: money. Ever since the implementation of the farming puppets, a significant portion of the yearly crop yield has been left to rot in granaries. As the price of rice plummets, rather than stocking up on foodstuffs, many have shifted to hoarding gold and silver. There's only so much gold and silver to go around. If all of it had been hoarded away, then it's inevitable that the national treasury remains empty. Ingots cannot be created out of thin air, and a distant spring cannot quench present thirst. Even if we were to mint more coinage, it would be too little too late. Thus, we must look to foreign trade as a source of gold and silver. Once the Silk Road has been fully established, it will be Yifu's most monumental accomplishment. Even 100 quelled rebellions won't compare to such a feat. As long as there is money, Chang'e continued, the house will have its rafters and the people will have their pillar of support. Then, we can slowly address the nation's domestic affairs, like a pot simmering over a low flame. There will still be challenges, but the situation will not escalate. We can look forward to centuries of peace and prosperity. After a few generations of stability, perhaps we will find a way forward. Chang'e sighed softly. It's unfortunate that both armed rebellions in the last few years involved the black market. His Majesty's extreme reaction is unsurprising. Truthfully, I suspect that the incidents in the East Sea and on the southern border are no coincidence. I've been borrowing the Lin Yuan Pavilion's resources to investigate and have only recently come upon a vague lead, but our enemies are truly devious. Yifu, you must be careful. After listening to Chang'e's speech, Guyuan fell silent for a long while, his expression difficult to read. Chang'e left him to his thoughts and slowly accompanied him out of the national temple. The evening drum reverberated from within the temple, echoing into the mountains. In the deep silence that followed, snow drifted down without a sound. Old General Zhong could raise a military commander capable of bringing peace to the nation through battlefield victories, but he couldn't single-handedly produce an official talented enough to govern the nation and pacify the land. Not for the first time, Guyuan was overcome by intense regret. Why must this child be surnamed Li? If Chang'e were not the Prince Li Min, becoming an official through the imperial examination would be as easy as the flip of the palm. Rather than sharing a few stray thoughts with Guyuan in this lousy temple while proclaiming that his only desire was to idle his days away as a pretty but useless fixture in court, he could enjoy a meteoric rise, aid the nation in its recovery, become the greatest statesman of his generation. But such was his fate. The weather is worsening, and Yifu is much too lightly dressed, Chang'e said. Instead of riding back on your horse, why not join me in my carriage? Guyuan was still lost in thought. At the sound of his voice, Guyuan turned his head and unexpectedly met Chang'e's eyes. His heart stuttered in his chest. He never noticed how Chang'e looked at him before. His gaze, faintly reflecting the soft white snow, was unwavering in its focus. It was as if he wished to swallow Guyuan whole within the depths of his eyes. Startled, Chang'e swiftly looked away. He dropped his head and flicked his sleeve in an attempt to appear innocuous, but only seemed all the more suspicious. The sleeve was already soaked through, and the fabric stuck to his hand. Only then did Guyuan realize Chang'e's shoulder had been covered in a chilly layer of melted snow. He hadn't said a word about it as he accompanied Guyuan on his unhurried stroll. Guyuan reached out and ran his hand over the damp fabric. It was icy to the touch. You... The instant he lifted his hand, Chang'e's body tensed. It lasted only a fleeting moment, but it did not escape Guyuan's eyes. Guyuan wasn't one to bother with trivialities in his private life. He was rather indifferent and rarely took note of such minor details. But with the awkwardness from his drunken episodes still fresh in his mind, he found himself more sensitive to Chang'e's reactions than usual. Am I imagining things? Guyuan wondered, bewildered, as he climbed into the horse-drawn carriage. The heater within the carriage had already been lit, so Guyuan leaned back and closed his eyes to rest. He was half asleep when he felt someone draw near. He kept his eyes closed and, after a beat, felt Chang'e lay a thick blanket over him. His touch was light as a feather, as if afraid of waking him. When it was Shen Yi, the man only ever carelessly tossed a blanket on top of him, and even that made him an exceedingly considerate subordinate. His motions were never so gentle one might mistake them for loving devotion. Guyuan's drowsiness evaporated at once. He strained to continue feigning sleep, not moving a millimeter, until his neck was stiff with the effort. The whole time, he felt as if there were a pair of eyes staring unblinkingly at him. Perhaps there are no secrets in this world that can be perfectly concealed, merely those who fail to observe the subtlest clues. A chord inside Guyuan's heart quietly drew taut, and he couldn't help but begin to stealthily observe Chang'e. But rather than dispel those indescribable misgivings, the longer he watched, the more panic-stricken he became. Along with the internal turmoil caused by Chang'e, Guyuan had his hands full worrying about the gold consolidation decree and the emperor's attempts to crack down on the violet gold black market. On top of that, he needed to formulate a roundabout way to rescue the Lingshu Institute's #1 curmudgeon, Master Feng Han. It was a hellish situation that left Guyuan mentally and physically wrung out. On the 23rd day of the first month, Guyuan traveled to the outskirts of the capital to see off Shen Yi, who was leaving for his new post in the southwest. On the 25th day of the first month, the emperor's imperial dragon carriage broke down in the middle of his tour of the imperial gardens. A chance remark by one of his personal attendants reminded the long-gone emperor that Master Feng Han had once knelt down to help him fix his steam-powered carriage. Much of the anger scorching in his heart promptly receded. After further inquiry, he learned just how solitary and impoverished the old man was. Namely, that after being imprisoned, aside from his students from the Lingshu Institute who came to see him, he didn't have a single friend or family member to bring him food. The long-gone emperor happened to be in a good mood, and after hearing all this, he found himself pitying the old man. Sighing, he ordered that Zhang Fenghan be released from prison, and only deducted half a year of the man's salary as punishment. Thus, this case came to a close. With these two matters put to bed, Guyuan couldn't stand to remain in the capital a day longer. He submitted a memorial requesting to return to Lolan. Indeed, it was about time he was on his way. The emperor had no objection and approved his request the day it was submitted. Now it was the evening before Guyuan was set to pack up and leave. The night had already grown old, and he had just finished taking his medicine. Although Chang'e had treated him with acupuncture for some time, such means could only dull his symptoms. They couldn't eradicate his headache at its source. It was then, as he lay struggling to fall asleep, that a messenger arrived with a summons for the Marquis of Anding to enter the imperial palace. Perhaps it was the side effect of the medicine. Guyuan's eyelids suddenly began to twitch. Chapter 49. Defiance. Guyuan rose at once and threw on some clothes. When he stepped out of his room, he was shocked to find Changgong waiting in the outer chamber. He had yet to retire and appeared to have just shrugged on his outer robe. A pocket gas lamp gave off a pea-sized halo of light by his hand, and a half-read book lay open on his knees. The outer chamber was usually the territory of nighttime attendants, but Guyun was accustomed to living simply. He had no attendants, and only asked the old housekeeper to stop by occasionally in the early evening to load up the coals for the underfloor heating. "Chang'eng?" Guyun asked, stunned. "What are you doing here? I thought it was Uncle Wang." "I wanted to wait till you fell asleep before leaving," Chang'eng replied. "You're a commandery prince." Guyuan's brow creased in a deep frown, and he hesitated, his words turning on the tip of his tongue. After a beat, he said promptly, "Lowering yourself to stay in the servants' quarters. It's completely inappropriate." "What do you mean, lowering myself? Must I abide by such superficial courtesies in my own home?" Chang'eng asked mildly. He rose to pick up the little kettle warming on the stove, then poured a bowl of medicinal tea and handed it to Guyun. "Is Yifu going to the palace? If you refuse to wear a fur coat, then at least drink something hot before you go." A strange anxiety seized Guyuan's heart. Even a duly wedded wife would find herself hard-pressed to match Changgeng's level of attentiveness. Guyuan mentally slapped himself the instant that thought unfurled in his mind. "You absolute bastard! Have you lost your mind?" He drained his medicinal tea in a gulp. As he passed the cup back to Changgeng, their fingers brushed. Changgeng flinched back slightly, as if scalded, then turned around to set the little kettle back in its place with an air of nonchalance. Watching his back, Guyuan's eyes dimmed slightly. "We can't go on like this," he thought. "When I get back from the palace, I have to have a proper talk with him, no matter what." The palace attendant was waiting expectantly at the gate. Guyuan left in a hurry, unable to linger a moment longer. The first month of the year was marked by cold frost and heavy dew. After a few gusts of glacial wind, Guyuan's disordered mind cleared as if pricked by a pin. The attendant leading the way didn't dare lift his head. As they walked beneath the palace walls, they passed guards every few steps. Qilin-shaped crossbows glared at them from all directions, forming neat arrays of beast heads breathing white steam through their fanged mouths. The gears in their necks turned slowly, emitting low grinding sounds like the roars of wild animals. The combination was so awe-inspiring that the red walls and glazed roof tiles seemed impossible to look at directly. The giant palace lanterns floated in mid-air and shrouded in thick mist and giving off a hazy, otherworldly glow. Yet there was nothing ethereal about these lanterns. The light they shed was coldly sinister, almost ghoulish in nature. The long-gone emperor's personal attendant, Zhu Xiaojiao, was escorting several people out of the warm pavilion in the west wing of the palace when he happened to cross paths with Guyun. Behind him was a group of far westerners led by a tall, thin man with white hair and falcon-like features. He had a pair of menacing eyes, an aquiline nose, and thin, barely visible lips that framed a knife-like gash on his mouth. Zhu Xiaojiao hurried forward and greeted Guyun. "My lord, these are the Pope's envoy from the west." The white-haired man examined Guyun. When he spoke, his accent was indistinguishable from the standard speech of Great Liang officials. "Could this be the illustrious Marquis of Anding?" he asked. Guyun's lashes were dusted with a fine layer of snow, his whole person shrouded in an icy chill. He cupped his hands in greeting, face a mask of cool indifference. In contrast, the white-haired man pressed a hand to his chest with utmost solemnity and bowed. "I didn't expect the Marquis of Order to be such a young and handsome man. It is an honor to make your acquaintance." Guyun nodded slightly. "You flatter me." The two groups passed each other. When the Westerners were some way off, Guyun shot a glance at Zhu Xiaojiao. He winked at Guyun, then stepped forward to whisper in his ear. "I don't know what those hairy Westerners said, but His Majesty is in an incredibly good mood right now. He kept saying they ought to send for the Marquis. so you can relax. It's not bad news. The old eunuch's depravity was known to all under heaven, and, true to his awful reputation, he was the emperor's most accomplished bootlicker. However, he had a decent relationship with Guyuan. One might say he had watched Guyuan grow up within the palace. Once, Zhu Xiaojiao had accidentally angered the late emperor, and Guyuan happened to witness the incident. The young marquis had casually offered a few words on his behalf, thereby saving his life. Zhu Xiaojiao might have been a moral degenerate, but he was conscientious when it came to paying debts of gratitude, and always remembered the kindness Guyuan had showed him. The rescue of Zhang Fenghan the other day had been thanks to his efforts in orchestrating events from behind the scenes. Despite his reassuring words, unease rose in Guyuan's heart. Honestly, he would have felt more prepared if the emperor had been unhappy. In that case, he could have been almost certain that someone had impeached him for buying violet gold on the black market. It didn't matter if someone accused him. Guyuan had already instructed his subordinates to tie up loose ends. With no proof, at worst, he and the emperor might get into a heated argument. But His Majesty is in an incredibly good mood? Guyuan's eyes twitched even more sharply. When he stepped into the warm pavilion, he saw Li Feng with his head bent over a memorial. The long-gone emperor didn't seem particularly joyful in the lamplight. In fact, he seemed even more haggard than Guyuan, whose own vicious headache had only just receded. Before Guyuan could perform his customary greeting, Li Feng waved a hand and said pleasantly, "There's no one else here. There's no need for uncle to be so courteous." Li Feng turned to Zhu Xiaojiao. "Go ask if there's any ginseng soup left from the evening meal," he said. "Bring a bowl for my imperial uncle so he may warm his hands." Guyuan sighed and thought to himself, "He who offers unsolicited hospitality must be harboring ill intentions." Blissfully unaware of Guyuan's uncharitable thoughts, Li Feng asked blithely, "I recall the last time we spoke. Uncle mentioned that a portion of the violet gold obtained by the trader Fu Zhicheng came from the south?" "That's correct. Please forgive my incompetence. I could not track down the source of this violet gold." Li Feng didn't seem to mind. "No matter. These traders are all wickedly cunning, and you were unfamiliar with the terrain. The fact that Uncle managed to uncover the bandits' secret passages and apprehend them so rapidly, it already is a remarkable feat. If even you call yourself incompetent, oughtn't we toss out all the civil and military officials in our court?" Still unable to figure out what he was getting at, Guyuan hastily assured Li Feng that he wouldn't dare suggest anything of the kind. "The violet gold black market in Great Liang has gone unchecked for too long." Li Feng's tone shifted as he came to his point. "In recent days, we have dispatched our people to thoroughly investigate the black market. We have discovered that a significant portion of the violet gold originates beyond our nation's boundaries." At once, Guyuan understood. Individuals within the country who had been lacking violet gold from government sources had finally caught wind of the crackdown through their own channels and, seeing which way the wind was blowing, had gone to ground. The ones caught by Jiang Chong and his men were small fry who had excavated private mines. Guyuan listened in silence. "Uncle spends much of his time traversing the frontiers," Li Feng continued unprompted. "You possess much more experience and insight than those of us who spend all our time viewing the world from the capital like a frog seeing the sky from the bottom of a well. Do you know where most of these private mines are located?" Guyuan hesitated slightly. "To answer your majesty, many are located in the northern barbarian grasslands." "Correct," Li Feng smiled. "However, that's not the whole story. Uncle, please come take a look at this." Guyuan accepted the confidential memorial from Li Feng and skimmed it rapidly. Suddenly, blood roared in his ears. The confidential memorial cataloged, in fine detail, routes for the sale of violet gold excavated from private mines. None of the names listed were any surprise to Guyuan, with the sole exception of the last item. Written at the very bottom, clear as day, was Kingdom of Lolan. How could Lolan be listed here? Li Feng glanced at him. "Well?" Guyuan broke out in a cold sweat, and countless thoughts swirled through his mind in the space of an instant. "Your Majesty, The Black Iron Battalion and the Kingdom of Lolan have lived as neighbors for many years. I have no knowledge of any violet gold mines within Lolan. Please forgive my presumption, but may I ask who submitted this memorial? What evidence do they have of this? Aye, Uncle, why are you acting so paranoid? Li Feng asked, laughing. It's not as if we accused you of colluding with these violet gold excavating scoundrels. It's no surprise that you didn't know about this. Guyuan took a deep breath and assumed an expectant expression, waiting to be enlightened. This is a rather long and convoluted tale, Li Feng began. During the 9th month last year, Uncle led a detachment of soldiers to the southern border. While you were away, Lolan asked the remaining Black Iron Battalion troops for help surrounding and annihilating a group of desert raiders. Assistant Regional Commander Chu Wenshan sent a team and seized a decisive victory. Not only did they hunt down and kill over 100 desert raiders, they also managed to rescue a group and captured Sindhu merchants. These merchants carried travel documents allowing them to enter Great Liang. So Commander Chu followed protocol and escorted them to the Western Relay Station. However, when they arrived there, they were shocked to discover that these merchants' documents were fake. Li Feng was in high spirits. He paused dramatically, as if deliberately keeping his listener in suspense. Yet, when he turned back, he found Guyuan's expression inexplicably grave, lacking any intention of asking him eagerly to continue. The Emperor couldn't help but feel slightly vexed. He carried on dully. By law, those who forge travel documents are handed over to the Protectorate of the Northwest to be investigated and punished. Yet, when the Protector General looked into their backgrounds, he discovered these Sindhu folk weren't merchants at all, but a group of gold scuttles from the black market. These so-called gold scuttles were desperados who smuggled violet gold. As it happened, our secret envoy had just reached the western regions. He hadn't even put down his bags before he ran into these gold scuttles. According to these traitorous rogues' confessions, they were working in a private mine beyond the Great Northern Pass until they obtained a treasure map, which marked several locations in Lolan with huge violet gold reserves. Thus, they came to try their luck. It's funny, isn't it? The fact that we are more familiar with what's buried under Lolan than the Lolan people themselves. A chill ran down Guyuan's spine. He suddenly remembered 4 years ago when the Black Iron Battalion had captured that group of desert raiders. The raiders had long been silenced by him and Shun Yi. Afterward, Guyuan had dispatched his subordinates on secret investigations within Lolan more than once. Yet he had never found any of these elusive violet gold mines, nor had he come across any similar cases. And now, years later, just as this incident had almost completely faded to the back of his mind, it had been dug up once again. Also, why was the commanding officer who sent the troops Chu Wenshan? Chu Wenshan was the assistant regional commander of the Black Iron Battalion, responsible for laying out the battalion's defense. He rarely handled any matters concerning trade routes. Had someone more experienced been in command, they would have never handed the merchants over to the Protector General before authenticating the travel documents. The Protector General's office was directly subordinate to the central government. Once they had custody of the prisoners, the Black Iron Battalion lost any authority it might have to follow up on the case. Guyuan had taken Shun Yi with him, but the Black Iron Battalion's 3 division commanders had all remained in Lolan. Where was everybody? Guyuan's thoughts took a sharp turn. If I may be so bold to ask your majesty, when did this desert raider attack occur? The end of last year, Li Feng responded. Why do you ask? Guyuan summoned up a smile with difficulty. It's nothing. This subject just finds it a bit strange. The desert raiders of the western region were purged long ago. Why did they appear again with no warning? His headache was worsening, the pain that had been suppressed by Changgung's acupuncture surging forth once more. Now he recalled, at the end of the year, there was a great market, and people of all nations gathered at the entrance of the Silk Road. The Black Iron Battalion always dispatched additional personnel to guard the area. What's more, the protective escort bringing the annual tributes from the northern border passed through the northwest at the same time, and The number of black steeds were usually resigned to assist with transport. Everyone had been sent away. Why did the desert raiders happen to attack at precisely this time? Why did the long-gone emperor's secret envoy arrive just as the protector general discovered the identities of the gold scuttles, thus leaving no chance for intervention? And finally, why had he received no word about any of these matters before or after they happened? Guyuan's heart seemed to tighten like a string pulled taut, and his mind twisted into a knotted mess. Standing inside the warm pavilion, temperate as spring all seasons of the year, he suddenly found it difficult to breathe. The desert raiders of the western regions tend to skulk beyond the borders of Great Liang's borders, Li Feng went on. Absent a request for aid, it would be inappropriate to send troops outside our territory, so of course it's difficult to track their movements or numbers. The reason we called Uncle here today is not to ask how many desert raiders lurk in the wastes, but because we wish to entrust you with an important matter. Guyuan lifted his head and gazed at him. Under the lamplight, Li Feng's eyes blazed with fire. Our secret envoy is currently deep undercover in Lowland territory. There's a good chance that there really is a rare vein of violet gold concealed beneath the lands of Lowland. Does Uncle take our meaning? Guyuan's heart sank in his chest. Slowly, emphasizing every word, he said, I beg forgiveness for my ignorance. Please enlighten me, Your Majesty. Li Feng's hand pressed down on his shoulder. Guyuan's body never seemed to warm up. No matter where or when, he was like a boulder that had spent 3 days frozen in ice. Uncle, if I may speak plainly, you know well the difficulties that plague Great Liang both at home and abroad, Li Feng said with a sigh. Our mind is so deeply troubled by the problems that we struggle to sleep at night. We have no one we can confide in. It is wearying, bearing the burdens of such a nation. Guyuan considered his next words for a beat, then said tactfully, Your Majesty attends to myriad state affairs every day. You are the hope of the people. Please take care of your health. I am unversed in government affairs, but I have overseen the establishment of the Silk Road these past few years. The region becomes livelier with each passing day, and wealthy merchants of the Northwest have begun to venture abroad. The people of the Central Plains have always been conscientious and hardworking. I believe that in just a few more years, the prosperity we now see on the Silk Road will spread throughout the entirety of Great Liang. When that time comes, his evasive flattery was like a bucket of cold water splashed in the face of the fervent Li Feng. Marquis Gu, Li Feng interjected curt, you are indeed unversed in government affairs. It's true that the nation has profited from trade routes these past few years, but can you guarantee that they will continue to prosper in the future? How well do you know these businessmen and their affairs? We certainly had no idea that, in addition to slaughtering enemies on the battlefield, the Marquis of Order is also an expert in the ways of commerce. The Emperor's mood had soured. Guyuan knew the second he heard Marquis Gu that he ought to shut his mouth, accepting his orders, and do his job as commanded. He fell silent. Behind the Emperor, a gas lamp in the pavilion began to flicker unsteadily with a soft hiss. Only a short while ago, Guyuan mused, he had solemnly vowed to Justice Jiang that he dared not lower himself to engage in petty quarrels for petty reasons. Rubbing the space between his brows, Li Feng broke the impasse between them. Forget it, he said with a stiff wave of his hand. Go back and rest for now. We have briefed you on this matter, so go home and think it over carefully. Spring is yet to come, and the Northwest is still bitterly cold. There is no need for my dear subject to hurry back. Your Majesty. Guyuan closed his eyes briefly, then swiftly lifted the hem of his robes to kneel before Li Feng. He had said he wouldn't throw tantrums or argue over useless codes of loyalty, but how could this possibly compare to such insignificant trifles? Please forgive me, Your Majesty, Guyuan said. Violet gold is certainly a matter of great importance, but please pardon my dull wit and inability to understand the deeper significance of Your Majesty's decision. The peace and prosperity of the Silk Road has not come easily. Does your majesty truly wish to cast it aside for the sake of some unsubstantiated rumors? It's impossible to ignore Marquis Gu's contributions to the Silk Road's current affluence. We understand that you hate to see it destroyed, given how many years of heart's blood you have poured into its development. How could our heart not ache as well? Li Feng replied, patiently curbing his temper. But this great nation of ours is like a dilapidated house filled with drafty windows. The slightest rain shower gusts in, and we must frantically tear down the eastern wall to repair the western wall. We lack resources in every area. Guyuan sneered internally, but it wouldn't do to reveal his true feelings. His countenance remained indifferent. It is cold on the floor. Uncle's complexion looks rather poor, and I can still smell the scent of your medicine. Please stop kneeling like this. Li Feng's expression warmed as he tried again to reason with Guyuan. When we were young, Grand Tutor Lin once told us that 2 arms form the strength of the nation: heavenly blessings and man-made creations. Does Uncle remember? I do. The Grand Tutor said, the heavenly blessings are the mountains and rivers, the trees and vegetation, the types of soil, the variety of fauna, and the violet gold flowing beneath the earth. The man-made creations are the aphorisms of sages, the techniques of construction, and inventions such as steam engines and steel armor. These 2 entities are like unto the pillar and rafter of a house. You can rely solely on one of the 2, but if both are broken, the structure will crumble. This is something a sovereign must bear in mind. Uncle's memory is impressive. Li Feng gazed down at him. Today, the pillar and rafter of our nation have been hollowed out by termites. What can we do? In all honesty, Guyuan wanted to say, if you didn't enact the ridiculous token of mastery law, perhaps there would be fewer termites eating our house. But he thought of Master Feng Han, currently shut away in his home reflecting on his mistakes in the company of his canine son. Even if he did say it aloud, there would be no use. Perhaps remembering their childhood days, when they studied side by side as fellow students, the anger on Li Feng's face gradually receded. Please rise. Uncle is the sharp blade of our nation. We must still rely on you to maintain order throughout the land. Guyuan bowed low, lightly touching his forehead to his fingertips. Li Feng breathed a sigh of relief, feeling as though he had finally gotten through to his stubborn subject. Guyuan had grown increasingly moderate in recent years, adapting smoothly to his new circumstances. He no longer exploded at the slightest provocation the way he did back when Li Feng first ascended the throne. His mild defiance today was likely only due to alarm at hearing the word Lolan. And, well, it was Lolan. Guyuan had been stationed there for over 5 years. It was understandable that he would develop an attachment toward the place. At this thought, Li Feng's expression softened once more. He resolved to personally help Guyuan to his feet, but before he could reach out, Guyuan had already straightened his back. Your Majesty, he said, voice quiet. Although Lolan is small, it has always been a friend to our nation. Back when so many countries in the western regions rose in armed rebellion, our troops were besieged in those barren yellow sand dunes for more than 20 days. It was the citizens of Lolan who secretly relayed information to us and supplied us with food and medicine. Later, when the far west, Sindhu, and the kingdoms of the western regions signed the new agreement to expand the Silk Road, Lolan joined the accord as well. Caught off guard, Li Feng stared blankly in shock for a beat, then exploded in an uncontrollable rage. Enough! He shouted. Sending troops to invade another sovereign nation because you covet their riches would be inhumane. Turning your back on past kindnesses, breaking promises, and betraying trust would be immoral. Guyuan hadn't said enough at all, and his every word was like a knife crashing decisively to the floor of the gilded warm pavilion. Li Feng shook with anger. Silence! He swept his hand through the brushes and ink on the table, picked up the inkstone, and flung it at the kneeling man. Guyuan made no attempt to dodge. The inkstone knocked harshly against his armor-encased shoulder with a bright, resounding clack, and wet ink dripped down the front of the Marquis of Anding's cloud brocade court robes. Li Feng glared with such ferocity his eyes were nearly torn from their sockets. Guyuan, what are you trying to do? Slow and deliberate, Guyuan spoke. An army that is inhumane and immoral is inauspicious. Although the 50,000 soldiers of the Black Iron Battalion do not fear death, I dare not accept this mission. Please rescind your orders, Your Majesty. Well. Look what we have here. Um, I'm not gonna lie. I'm a little bit concerned for Guyun right now because he's pissing off His Highness. Also, it's so funny because His Highness was definitely like, oh, Guyun has mellowed out. And then suddenly, boop, up, you spoke too soon. Sorry, I meant His Majesty. You know. Let's get to everything, shall we? The first thing I want to ask, which I'm sure we're all asking, is Guyun, who is Ayan? Because I want to know who it was that you were talking to when you were drunk. Or rather, who you thought you were talking to and getting all frisky with. Enlighten me. But the other thing that I wanted to mention was on page 166, where it says, perhaps all people are like this. We want our lives to improve day by day, so when we reach a plateau, even if we are already well off, we feel a sense of restless frustration. And I just thought that was such a relatable line because it's definitely true. And it even gave me some food for thought. You know, we live in a world where we're constantly trying to improve, constantly trying to get better. And a lot of times I think we forget to just live in the moment, like be in the moment and enjoy what it is that we're doing instead of thinking about, okay, how can I get better? How can I get better? Like, of course, yes, getting better at things and improving your mastery is a wonderful thing. But there are times where we should just be able to bask in the moment. Now, I know that they're kind of talking about different things going on in this situation, but still, it applies. And so for me personally, that really stuck out to me, and I was really happy to see it mentioned because it just reminded me in my own personal journey, like, hey, basically go easy on yourself. Like, be gracious with yourself. So for anyone out there who feels like they've reached a plateau in whatever that you're doing, I want to tell you, as honored by Guyun's inspiration, be patient with yourself. All right? Okay, you're doing great. Anyway, the last thing that I wanted to say is that I think it's absolutely funny to see these little moments of Guyun being the one sweating bullets or being nervous about his interactions with Chang'e, or things that he's thinking about Chang'e, like, oh my gosh, why am I thinking this about my godson? It's so cute and it's so funny. Oh, no, I take that back. There was one more thing. I don't know about you guys, but I really, really like Shunyi. And I look forward to seeing more of his character, even though I know he, just left. But I love how such a geek he is for steampunk stuff and all the gadgets and everything. But I'm also wondering, if anyone else knows, please don't say in the comments, please, if there is going to be some kind of side romance or something between Shunyi and Ge Pangxiao, or if I'm just thinking too much into it. Because there was a moment when Shunyi had basically said something along the lines of wanting to take Ge Pangxiao with him. And it said that Guyun looked at him like there was something odd about those words, or he felt like they were said in a weird way. And I was like, is there going to be a side romance going on? Because that would be quite interesting. Anyway, I don't even remember how old Ge Pangxiao is, but he should be an adult, right? Okay, if he's not, then scratch that whole thing, but I think so. Anyway, I'm not going to ramble anymore. I will see you all next time, and 我爱你们.